In the heart of a bustling downtown diner, where the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sizzle of breakfast platters, Rose Thompson had been serving customers for over 15 years. Her warm smile and gentle demeanor were as much a part of the small-town diner as its famous blueberry pancakes. At 42, she had seen countless faces come and go, but there was something special about the elderly woman who started visiting the diner 3 years ago. Mrs. Eleanor Baker, a retired school teacher, first came to the diner on a quiet Tuesday morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to manage her walker, and Rose noticed her struggling with the heavy glass door. Without hesitation, Rose rushed to help, holding the door open and guiding Mrs. Baker to a cozy corner booth by the window. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Baker had said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Her eyes crinkled with warmth despite the obvious pain she was in, and Rose felt an immediate connection to this gentle soul. That morning marked the beginning of a beautiful friendship that would touch not just their lives, but the entire community. Mrs. Baker began coming to the diner 3 times a week, always sitting in the same corner booth. Rose made sure to keep an eye out for her arrival, ready to help her inside and get her settled comfortably. As the weeks turned into months, Rose learned more about Mrs. Baker's life. She had taught second grade for over 4 decades, shaping young minds and touching countless lives. Now, at 78, she lived alone in a small apartment 2 blocks away. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago, and her only child lived across the country with his own family. "Sometimes the silence at home gets too loud," Mrs. Baker had confided one morning, stirring her tea with shaking hands. "Coming here, seeing friendly faces, it helps." Rose understood loneliness all too well. As a single mother raising 2 teenagers on a waitress's salary, she knew how it felt to carry heavy burdens alone. She started paying special attention to Mrs. Baker's needs, memorizing her preferences and anticipating what might make her more comfortable. When Mrs. Baker's arthritis made it difficult to cut her food, Rose would discreetly pre-cut her pancakes in the kitchen before serving. On cold mornings, she'd have a hot cup of chamomile tea waiting before Mrs. Baker even asked. These small gestures didn't feel like extra work to Rose, they were simply extensions of her caring nature. Other regular customers began noticing the special bond between the waitress and the elderly woman. They watched as Rose would adjust Mrs. Baker's chair, help her with her coat, or sit with her during quiet moments to share stories and gentle laughter. The diner's atmosphere seemed to grow warmer whenever they interacted, their friendship casting a glow that touched everyone around them. One particularly challenging morning, Mrs. Baker arrived at the diner looking more tired than usual. Rose noticed her wincing with each step, her knuckles white as she gripped her walker. Without drawing attention to Mrs. Baker's struggle, Rose quietly asked the kitchen to prepare her usual order while she helped her to her seat. "My arthritis is acting up something fierce today," Mrs. Baker admitted, her voice wavering. "I almost didn't come, but I couldn't bear another morning alone with my thoughts." Rose pulled up a chair and sat with her for a moment, speaking softly. "I'm glad you came, Mrs. Baker. Sometimes the best medicine is just being around people who care about you." That morning, Rose spent her entire break sitting with Mrs. Baker, sharing stories about her kids and listening to tales about Mrs. Baker's teaching days. She noticed how the pain in Mrs. Baker's eyes seemed to ease as they talked, replaced by the familiar twinkle that Rose had come to cherish. Word of Rose's kindness spread through the community. Regular customers would often slip her extra tips, telling her to use the money to treat Mrs. Baker to breakfast. But Rose always politely declined, explaining that caring for Mrs. Baker wasn't about money, it was about human connection. The diner's owner, touched by Rose's dedication, started allowing her to take longer breaks when the restaurant wasn't busy, knowing she would spend them keeping Mrs. Baker company. He saw how their friendship brought something special to his establishment, creating an atmosphere of compassion that drew more customers in. As winter approached that year, Rose noticed Mrs. Baker struggling more with the cold weather. The walk from her apartment became increasingly difficult, yet she continued to visit the diner regularly. Rose started arriving at work early on the coldest mornings, keeping an eye out for Mrs. Baker through the front windows. As soon as she spotted her, Rose would grab her coat and rush outside to help her navigate the icy sidewalk. "You're an angel," Mrs. Baker would say, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "I don't know what I did to deserve such kindness." Rose would simply smile and say, "You bring as much joy to my life as I bring to yours, Mrs. Baker. That's what friendship is about." The other waitresses at the diner began following Rose's example, showing extra patience and care with their elderly customers. They saw how Rose's simple acts of kindness created ripples of positive change throughout their community. Young families would bring their children to the diner, pointing out Rose and Mrs. Baker's interaction as examples of how to treat others with respect and compassion. But what no one knew, not even Mrs. Baker, was that Rose was quietly organizing something special. Every time she helped the elderly woman with her coat, every time she saw her struggling with the walk to and from the diner, an idea was taking shape in her mind. She had witnessed Mrs. Baker's determination to maintain her independence, but she also saw the toll it was taking on her friend's health. As spring bloomed outside the diner's windows, Rose's determination grew stronger. She had been secretly talking to other regular customers about Mrs. Baker's situation, sharing her concerns about the elderly woman's daily struggles. What started as casual conversations soon evolved into something much bigger than Rose could have imagined. One morning, while serving coffee to Tom, a local real estate agent who had been coming to the diner for breakfast every day for the past decade, Rose mentioned how Mrs. Baker's apartment building had no elevator, forcing her to navigate steep stairs despite her condition. "It breaks my heart to see her struggling," Rose confided, her voice low to ensure Mrs. Baker couldn't hear from her usual corner booth. "She's too proud to complain, but I can see how much pain she's in after climbing those stairs." Tom set down his coffee cup, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You know, I might be able to help with that. I have a client who owns several senior-friendly apartments just a few blocks from here. Ground floor units, wider doorways, everything designed for easier mobility." Rose's eyes lit up, but reality quickly dimmed her enthusiasm. "That sounds perfect, but Mrs. Baker lives on a fixed income. I don't think she could afford to move." "Let me make a few calls," Tom offered, pulling out his phone. Sometimes good people deserve good things to happen to them. Over the next few weeks, Rose noticed more of her regular customers huddling in conversations that would quickly stop when she approached. She was too busy to pay much attention, focusing instead on her increasing concern for Mrs. Baker, whose mobility seemed to be declining. One particularly difficult morning, Mrs. Baker arrived at the diner looking exhausted. "I had to rest 3 times on the stairs last night," she admitted when Rose brought her tea. "Sometimes I wonder how much longer I can manage on my own." Rose reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "You're not alone, Mrs. Baker. You have people who care about you." What Mrs. Baker didn't know was that those people were working together in ways she couldn't imagine. The local church group that met at the diner every Sunday had started collecting donations. The high school students who came in for afternoon snacks were offering to help with moving services. Even the gruff morning regulars who barely spoke to anyone were quietly contributing to the cause. Rose's teenagers, inspired by their mother's dedication, had started visiting Mrs. Baker on weekends, helping her with groceries and keeping her company. Her son would carry the heavy items up the stairs, while her daughter would organize Mrs. Baker's medications and help with light cleaning. "Your children are a testament to your wonderful heart," Mrs. Baker told Rose one morning, her eyes misting over. "You've raised them to be so thoughtful and kind." Rose smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "They've learned that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about the connections we choose to make." As summer approached, the diner's owner noticed Rose looking increasingly tired. He knew she had been picking up extra shifts to save money for something, but she wouldn't tell him what. What he didn't know was that Rose had been working at a second job in the evenings, cleaning offices after her diner shifts ended. Every extra dollar she earned went into a special account she had opened. Rose knew it wouldn't be enough on its own, but she was determined to contribute what she could to the growing community effort. The regular customers watched Rose's dedication with admiration. They saw how she never complained about her long hours, how she maintained her gentle patience with every customer, and how she continued to provide special care to Mrs. Baker despite her exhaustion. One morning, a group of business owners who frequently held breakfast meetings at the diner pulled Rose aside. They had noticed her extra hours and had figured out what she was trying to do. "We want to help," they told her. "What you're doing for Mrs. Baker, it's inspiring. Let us be part of this." Their offer of assistance brought tears to Rose's eyes. She had been carrying the weight of her plan largely alone, and suddenly she felt the support of an entire community behind her. The diner became more than just a restaurant, it transformed into a hub of secret planning and coordination. Customers would pass notes and whisper updates to each other. Local contractors offered their services at reduced rates. A furniture store owner promised to donate new, senior-friendly furniture. Through it all, Mrs. Baker remained unaware of the movement she had inspired. She continued her regular visits to the diner, sharing stories with Rose and brightening everyone's day with her gentle presence. Despite her increasing physical challenges, her spirit remained strong, though Rose could see the worry in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. One day, while helping Mrs. Baker with her coat, Rose noticed her friend's hands trembling more than usual. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. Mrs. Baker's eyes welled up with tears. "I received a notice yesterday. My apartment building is being sold. They're raising the rent significantly. I don't know what I'm going to do." Rose's heart clenched, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Everything will work out, Mrs. Baker. You've touched more lives than you know." That evening, after Mrs. Baker had gone home, Rose gathered with a group of regular customers who had stayed behind. The news about the apartment building added urgency to their plans. What had started as a simple idea to help an elderly woman had grown into a community-wide mission of compassion. The news of Mrs. Baker's potential displacement sparked a renewed sense of urgency among the diner's community. Tom, the real estate agent, spent his morning coffee breaks making calls to his contacts, while Rose worked tirelessly to coordinate the growing network of helpers, all while maintaining her cheerful presence at the diner. The summer heat had settled over the city, making Mrs. Baker's daily walk to the diner even more challenging. Rose noticed how her friend would arrive increasingly exhausted, her clothing damp with perspiration despite the early morning hours. Yet Mrs. Baker never complained, greeting everyone with the same warm smile that had endeared her to the entire diner community. One particularly hot morning, Mrs. Baker didn't show up at her usual time. Rose kept glancing at the door, her worry growing with each passing minute. By 9 o'clock, she couldn't concentrate on her work. During her break, she hurriedly walked to Mrs. Baker's apartment building, her heart pounding with concern. After climbing the 3 flights of stairs, Rose found Mrs. Baker sitting in her small apartment, looking pale and defeated. The air conditioning had broken down, and the apartment was stifling. "I just couldn't make it today," Mrs. Baker admitted, her voice trembling. "These stairs, they seem to get steeper every day." Rose immediately called her manager at the diner, explaining the situation. Without hesitation, he told her to take the rest of the morning off. What Mrs. Baker didn't know was that this crisis would become a catalyst for accelerating their secret plans. That afternoon, while Mrs. Baker rested at home, the diner became the center of an impromptu community meeting. The regular customers, many of whom had been contributing to the cause, gathered to discuss how they could speed up their timeline. The local handyman who always ordered the same breakfast sandwich offered to fix Mrs. Baker's air conditioning for free. A group of high school students volunteered to create a schedule to help her with daily errands. The owner of the local grocery store, who supplied the diner with fresh produce, suggested setting up a meal delivery service for days when Mrs. Baker couldn't make it to the diner. "We take care of our own," he said simply, his weathered face showing determination. Rose's children had grown particularly attached to Mrs. Baker over the past months. Her daughter had started recording Mrs. Baker's stories about her teaching days, preserving the memories that brought such joy to the elderly woman's face. Her son had been secretly fixing things around Mrs. Baker's apartment, tightening loose doorknobs and fixing squeaky hinges. "You know," Mrs. Baker had told Rose's daughter during one of their visits, "your mother saved my life in many ways. Before I started coming to the diner, I was so lonely I could barely get out of bed some days. But knowing she would be there, with her kind smile and gentle heart, gave me a reason to keep going." These words, when shared with Rose, only strengthened her resolve to help her friend. The community's secret project had grown far beyond its original scope. What had started as a simple plan to help Mrs. Baker move to a more suitable apartment had evolved into something much more meaningful. Local businesses began offering their services. The furniture store owner expanded his original offer, promising to fully furnish whatever new space they found. A local moving company volunteered their services for free. Even the city's mayor, who occasionally stopped by the diner for lunch, got involved, expediting necessary permits and paperwork. Rose continued working her second job, despite the exhaustion that showed on her face. Her regular customers noticed how she would sometimes pause to rub her tired eyes or roll her shoulders to ease the ache, but her smile never wavered, especially when Mrs. Baker was present. One quiet afternoon, while helping Mrs. Baker arrange her medications for the week, Rose's daughter discovered that her friend had been skipping doses of her arthritis medicine to make it last longer. The revelation hit Rose hard. She shared this information with the diner's community, and within days, a local pharmacist who frequented the diner had worked out a plan to help Mrs. Baker access her medications at a reduced cost. The project had taken on a life of its own, with different people contributing in whatever ways they could. A local artist who always sat in the corner booth sketching during breakfast began creating a beautiful welcome sign. The high school woodshop teacher offered to build custom accessibility modifications for whatever new space they found. Through it all, Mrs. Baker remained unaware of the movement she had inspired. She continued to visit the diner when she could, sharing stories about her teaching days and asking Rose about her children. Her situation had grown more difficult with the impending rent increase, but she tried to maintain a brave face. "I've been looking at other apartments," she confided in Rose one morning, her hands shaking as she stirred her tea. "But everything is so expensive now, and most places have stairs. I never thought I'd have to leave my home at this age." Rose wanted so badly to tell her friend about all the plans in motion, about how an entire community had come together to help her. Instead, she simply held Mrs. Baker's hand and assured her that things would work out. Behind the scenes, the pieces were finally falling into place. Tom had secured a perfect ground-floor apartment in a senior-friendly building, negotiating a reduced rent with the owner who had been moved by Mrs. Baker's story. The local contractors had already begun making subtle modifications to make the space even more accessible. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and falling leaves, the secret community project entered its final stages. The new apartment had been secured, modifications were nearly complete, and a move-in date was set. The challenge now was keeping everything hidden from Mrs. Baker while ensuring she wouldn't make any hasty decisions about her housing situation out of desperation. Rose noticed that Mrs. Baker had started bringing a small notebook to the diner, where she would write down phone numbers from rental listings in the newspaper. Each morning, her friend's face showed more worry lines as she struggled to find an affordable option. The sight made Rose's heart ache, knowing that relief was just around the corner but unable to reveal anything yet. One morning, Mrs. Baker arrived at the diner looking particularly distressed. "I received another notice yesterday," she said quietly as Rose brought her usual tea. "They're giving us all 60 days to either accept the new rent or move out. I've called every affordable housing complex in the area, but they all have waiting lists months long." Rose sat down beside her friend, their shoulders touching in a gesture of comfort. "Sometimes the best blessings come when we least expect them," she said softly. "You've got more people in your corner than you realize." That same afternoon, while Mrs. Baker was at a doctor's appointment, the diner hosted another community meeting. The local moving company presented their detailed plan for transport, while the furniture store owner showed photos of the pieces he'd selected based on Mrs. Baker's needs. Rose's teenagers had created a digital presentation of before and after photos of the new apartment's modifications. The high school art club had painted cheerful murals on the apartment walls, supervised by the local artist who frequented the diner. The scenes depicted peaceful gardens and familiar local landmarks, including a small rendering of the diner itself. They hoped these personal touches would help Mrs. Baker feel at home in her new space. The pharmacist had arranged for Mrs. Baker's medications to be delivered to the new address, while the grocery store owner had mapped out a more accessible route for his delivery service. Every detail was being considered, down to the height of the paper towel holders and the placement of nightlights in the hallways. Rose's co-workers at the diner had been instrumental in keeping the secret, expertly directing conversations away from suspicious topics whenever Mrs. Baker was present. They'd also organized a schedule for the first few weeks after the move, ensuring someone would always be available to check on Mrs. Baker as she adjusted to her new home. The diner's owner had noticed how the project had transformed his restaurant into more than just a place to eat. It had become a hub of community action, where people from all walks of life came together for a common cause. He decided to commemorate this by having a small plaque made for the corner booth where Mrs. Baker always sat. As the days counted down, Rose found herself growing both excited and nervous. The community had raised enough money to cover Mrs. Baker's rent for the first year, giving her time to adjust her budget without the immediate pressure of increased housing costs. Local businesses had pitched in gift cards for groceries and household items, while the high school's computer club had set up a tablet with simple video calling apps so she could stay connected with her son across the country. One Tuesday morning, about 2 weeks before the planned reveal, Mrs. Baker came into the diner looking defeated. She pulled out her notebook, now filled with crossed-out phone numbers and rejected options. "I think I might have to move in with my son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He offered months ago, but I didn't want to leave my community here. Now I might not have a choice." Rose felt her heart squeeze. She knew Mrs. Baker's son lived in a small apartment himself, and taking in his mother would be challenging for both of them. More importantly, she knew how much Mrs. Baker valued her independence and how devastating it would be for her to leave the community that had become her second family. "Give it a little more time," Rose urged, placing her hand over Mrs. Baker's trembling ones. "Sometimes miracles happen when we least expect them." That evening, after closing time, Rose sat in Mrs. Baker's usual booth, looking around the diner that had become the centerpiece of this remarkable story. The walls had witnessed countless acts of kindness, from small gestures like cutting up pancakes to the massive coordinated effort that was about to change her friend's life. She thought about how this project had started with a simple desire to help one person but had grown into something that transformed an entire community. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now working together, sharing resources, and building connections that would last long after the surprise was revealed. The local newspaper editor, who came in every morning for coffee, had asked to document the story but agreed to wait until after the surprise. He recognized that this wasn't just about one waitress helping one customer, it was about the power of community and the ripple effect of everyday kindness. Rose's children had been particularly excited about the project's progress. Her daughter had organized all of Mrs. Baker's teaching memorabilia, creating a beautiful display for one wall of the new apartment. Her son had worked with the contractors to install grab bars and ensure all fixtures were at comfortable heights. The morning of the planned surprise was approaching quickly, and the entire community was buzzing with nervous excitement. Rose had coordinated with Mrs. Baker's son, who had secretly flown in from across the country to be part of the special moment. He was staying with Rose's family, touched beyond words by the community's effort to help his mother maintain her independence while ensuring her safety and comfort. "I've been worried about Mom for years," he confided to Rose over coffee in her kitchen. "But knowing she has people like you in her life, it means everything. I can sleep better at night knowing she's not alone." The diner had become command central for the final preparations. Every morning before Mrs. Baker's usual arrival time, community members would gather to review their roles in the upcoming surprise. The local choir director, who always ordered a Western omelette, had organized a small group to sing Mrs. Baker's favorite hymns during the reveal. The high school drama teacher had helped choreograph how everyone would be positioned. Rose's manager had closed the diner for renovations on the big day, putting up signs that announced they would reopen for dinner service. This gave them the perfect cover for gathering everyone without raising suspicion. Mrs. Baker's son would pick her up that morning, telling her he was in town for a surprise visit and wanted to take her to breakfast at a different restaurant. The day before the surprise, Mrs. Baker seemed particularly down. She pushed her food around her plate, barely touching the blueberry pancakes that were usually her favorite. "I found a small apartment in my son's city," she said quietly. "It's not ideal, but I'm running out of options here. The stairs in my building have become impossible, and with the rent increase." Her voice trailed off as she fought back tears. Rose wanted so badly to tell her everything right then, to ease the worry that lined her friend's face. Instead, she squeezed Mrs. Baker's shoulder gently and said, "Tomorrow might bring better news than you expect. Don't give up hope just yet." That evening, after Mrs. Baker had gone home, the diner was transformed. The regular customers who had been part of the secret project helped decorate the space with subtle touches of autumn flowers and warm-colored ribbons. Rose's daughter had created a beautiful photo collage of Mrs. Baker's teaching days, mixed with recent pictures from the diner, showing the impact she'd had on multiple generations. The local bakery owner, who supplied the diner's pastries, had worked late into the night creating a special cake decorated with tiny fondant books and apples, honoring Mrs. Baker's years as a teacher. The florist down the street had donated arrangements that matched the colors in the new apartment, planning to transfer them there after the reveal. Rose barely slept that night, her mind running through every detail. She thought about the first time Mrs. Baker had walked into the diner, how that simple moment had set in motion a chain of events that brought out the best in their entire community. What had started as one person helping another had grown into something much more meaningful, a testament to the power of human connection. Early the next morning, Rose arrived at the diner while it was still dark outside. The parking lot gradually filled with familiar faces, the regular customers who had become part of this extended family, all arriving early to help with final preparations. The furniture store owner's truck was parked discreetly behind the building, ready to deliver the last few items to the new apartment after the surprise. The local police chief, who had been quietly monitoring the project's progress over his morning coffee for months, arranged for 2 officers to help manage traffic and parking, ensuring everything would run smoothly. The fire department had even offered their ladder truck to help hang a welcome banner, though they decided that might be a bit too conspicuous. Inside the diner, every detail was carefully arranged. Mrs. Baker's usual booth had been decorated with subtle elegance, and a path was cleared to make it easy for her to navigate with her walker. The local photographer, who had documented the entire renovation process at the new apartment, set up his equipment to capture the moment. Rose's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the final touches. Her manager noticed and pulled her aside, pressing a cup of tea into her hands. "Take a moment," he said kindly. "You've orchestrated something amazing here. Every single person in this room is here because of the example you set." Looking around, Rose saw the truth in his words. The diner was filled with people from all walks of life, business owners and high school students, retirees and young families, all united in their desire to help someone who had touched their lives with her gentle presence and kind heart. Mrs. Baker's son had texted that they were having breakfast at a cafe across town. He would bring her to the diner afterward, using the excuse that he wanted to meet the people his mother talked about so often in their phone calls. The timing had to be perfect, everyone needed to be in position when they arrived. The choir members practiced one last time, their harmonies soft and sweet in the morning air. The high school students who had helped with the apartment modifications straightened their clothes nervously, excited to be part of such a meaningful moment. Even the typically stoic morning regulars were misty-eyed as they took their positions. Through the front windows, Rose could see the autumn sun rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She thought about how this day would change Mrs. Baker's life, how the burden of worry would lift from her shoulders. But more than that, she thought about how this project had already changed their community, Bree. But more than that, she thought about how this project had already changed their community, breaking down barriers and bringing people together in ways she never expected. The morning sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows as everyone waited in hushed anticipation. Rose's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Baker's son. They were 5 minutes away. The excitement in the room was palpable as people took their final positions, their hearts beating in collective anticipation of the moment that would change one woman's life forever. Rose thought back to all the early mornings, late nights, and countless moments of community kindness that had led to this day. She remembered the local carpenter who had stayed up late installing handrails in the new apartment, the retired accountant who had helped organize the financial contributions, and the countless others who had played their parts in this beautiful conspiracy of kindness. The high school students who had helped with the apartment modifications were now straightening their clothes nervously, eager to see Mrs. Baker's reaction to their hard work. The local choir members stood ready, their sheet music clutched in slightly trembling hands. Even the usually stoic morning regulars were showing signs of emotion, dabbing at their eyes with napkins. Through the window, Rose spotted Mrs. Baker's son helping his mother from the car. She noticed how Mrs. Baker paused, looking confused at the "closed for renovations" sign, but her son gently encouraged her forward. Rose's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "But it's closed," they heard Mrs. Baker's muffled voice through the door. "Maybe we should come back later." "Trust me, Mom," her son said, opening the door. "There's something I want you to see." As Mrs. Baker stepped into the diner, leaning on her walker, the sight that greeted her made her stop in her tracks. The entire space was filled with familiar faces, all the people who had become part of her daily life over the past 3 years. The morning regulars who always nodded hello, the high school students who helped her with her coat, the business owners who shared friendly conversations, they were all there, smiling warmly. The choir began singing softly, their harmonies filling the air with a gentle melody that Mrs. Baker had once mentioned was her favorite hymn. Tears immediately began rolling down her cheeks as she looked around in bewilderment, her hand clutching her son's arm for support. Rose stepped forward, her own eyes glistening. "Mrs. Baker," she said softly, "we have something to tell you." The local real estate agent moved to stand beside Rose, holding a small envelope. "For the past few months," he began, "this community has been working on something special. We've all seen how the stairs in your building have become a challenge, how the rising rent has worried you." Mrs. Baker's free hand flew to her mouth as realization began to dawn on her face. Her son guided her to her usual booth, which had been decorated with fresh flowers and autumn leaves. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as Rose continued the explanation. "We found you a new home," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful ground-floor apartment, just 3 blocks from here. It's been modified especially for you, with wider doorways, grab bars, and all the comforts you need. The rent is locked in at an affordable rate for as long as you want to stay." The photographer captured the moment as Mrs. Baker's eyes widened in disbelief. Her son squeezed her shoulder gently as Tom stepped forward with photos of the apartment. The local artist who had painted the murals pointed out the familiar scenes on the walls, including the small rendering of the diner that had become her second home. But how? Mrs. Baker managed to whisper, looking around at all the faces she had come to know and love. The diner's owner stepped forward. Everyone you see here has contributed in some way. Some with money, some with time and skills, some with furniture and supplies. But most importantly, everyone contributed with love. Rose's children moved to stand beside Mrs. Baker's booth. Her daughter held out a tablet, showing her how it was already set up for video calls with her son. Her son explained the modifications they had made to make the space more comfortable and accessible. The local pharmacist explained how he had arranged for medication delivery to the new address. The grocery store owner described the delivery service they had set up. The high school woodshop teacher showed pictures of the custom-built shelves he had created to display Mrs. Baker's teaching memorabilia. As each person stepped forward to explain their part in the surprise, Mrs. Baker's tears flowed freely. These weren't the tears of worry and stress she had been carrying for months, they were tears of joy, of disbelief, of overwhelming gratitude. "I don't deserve all this," she whispered, looking around at the crowd of smiling faces. "Yes, you do," Rose said firmly, taking her friend's hand. "You've touched all of our lives in ways you never realized. Your kindness, your stories, your gentle presence, you've made this community better just by being part of it." The choir's soft music continued in the background as more people stepped forward to share their contributions. The furniture store owner described the comfortable chairs and adjustable bed he had selected. The local handyman explained the safety features he had installed. Each revelation brought fresh tears to Mrs. Baker's eyes. Her son, who had been quietly supporting his mother through the revelations, finally spoke up. "Mom, when you first told me about the problems with your apartment, I was worried sick. But then Rose reached out to me, told me about this amazing community and their plan. I knew then that you were exactly where you needed to be, surrounded by people who love you almost as much as I do." As the initial shock of the surprise began to settle, Mrs. Baker found herself surrounded by a sea of caring faces, each one representing a thread in the tapestry of kindness that had been woven around her. The diner, normally filled with the clatter of plates and casual conversation, was now alive with a different kind of energy, one of pure joy and celebration. "Would you like to see your new home?" Rose asked gently, noticing how overwhelmed her friend appeared. Mrs. Baker nodded, unable to form words through her tears. Her son carefully helped her up, and the entire group began their procession to the new apartment, just 3 blocks away. The autumn morning had turned into a perfect day, with golden sunlight filtering through the trees that lined the street. Several of the high school students had gone ahead to make sure everything was ready, their excitement evident in their hurried steps. The local police chief had arranged for a patrol car to follow slowly behind the group, ensuring everyone could walk safely at Mrs. Baker's pace. As they approached the building, Mrs. Baker's eyes widened at the sight of the beautiful entrance, complete with automatic doors and a gently sloped ramp. The property manager, who had become an enthusiastic supporter of the project, stood waiting with a warm smile and a small gift-wrapped box containing the keys to her new home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Baker," he said kindly, presenting her with the box. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the silver keys gleaming in the sunlight. Inside, the apartment took her breath away. The walls, painted in warm, soothing colors, featured the beautiful murals of local scenes that the art students had created. The furniture, carefully selected for both comfort and accessibility, was arranged to create easy pathways for her walker. Every detail had been considered, from the height of the light switches to the placement of handrails. The kitchen had been set up with easy-to-reach shelves and modified appliances. The local occupational therapist, who often stopped by the diner for lunch, had consulted on the design to ensure everything was perfectly suited to Mrs. Baker's needs. The countertops were at just the right height, and the cabinets had been fitted with pull-down shelves. In the living room, a comfortable recliner faced the window, offering a view of the tree-lined street below. Beside it stood a small table, already set up with the tablet for video calls with her son. The high school computer club had even created a simple guide with large print instructions for using the device. But it was the bedroom that brought fresh tears to Mrs. Baker's eyes. The walls were adorned with framed photographs from her teaching days, carefully restored and arranged by Rose's daughter. Her teaching certificates, awards, and cherished mementos had been displayed with loving care. The bed itself looked incredibly inviting, with its adjustable frame and pile of soft pillows. The bathroom had been completely modified for safety and comfort, with a walk-in shower featuring a built-in seat, easily accessible grab bars, and non-slip flooring. The local hardware store owner had installed a special mirror that could be tilted to accommodate both standing and seated use. As Mrs. Baker moved through each room, supported by her son and Rose, members of the community pointed out different features they had contributed. The retired electrician explained the motion sensor night lights he had installed. The local seamstress showed her the custom-made curtains that could be easily opened and closed from a seated position. In the small study area, Mrs. Baker discovered a beautiful surprise. A reading nook had been created, complete with a comfortable chair and good lighting. The local library had donated a collection of her favorite authors, and the bookshelf included a special section of children's books for when her grandchildren visited. The kitchen had been stocked with familiar items from her old apartment, along with some new additions. The grocery store owner had filled the refrigerator with fresh food, and a schedule for future deliveries was magnetized to the door. The local pottery artist had created custom dishes that were both beautiful and easy to handle. Throughout the tour, Mrs. Baker kept stopping to touch things gently, as if making sure they were real. Her son watched with tears in his eyes as his mother discovered each thoughtful detail that the community had incorporated into her new home. "I never dreamed," she kept saying, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never imagined." The high school students who had helped with the project were particularly excited to show her the small balcony garden they had created. Raised planters had been installed at the perfect height for her to tend to flowers and herbs without bending. The local garden center had contributed plants that would provide color throughout the seasons. Back in the living room, the choir had gathered once again, their voices lifting in celebration. The local baker had set up a small buffet of refreshments, including Mrs. Baker's favorite treats from the diner. People mingled, sharing stories about their involvement in the project and their joy at seeing it come to fruition. Rose stood slightly apart, watching as Mrs. Baker was surrounded by well-wishers. Her friend's face glowed with happiness, the worry lines that had been so prominent in recent months now replaced by smile lines. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the physical space that had been created, but in the spirit of the woman who had touched so many lives. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of Mrs. Baker's new apartment, the celebration continued with a warmth that matched the autumn day outside. The space was filled with conversation and laughter, with people moving between groups, sharing stories and celebrating the success of their secret project. Mrs. Baker had finally settled into her new comfortable chair, overwhelmed but radiant with joy. Her son sat beside her, holding her hand and watching as person after person approached to share their part in the story. The local quilting circle presented her with a handmade blanket, each square containing a message of love from different community members. The high school art students had created a guest book, its pages already filled with warm wishes and memories. Rose watched from nearby, her heart full as she saw the worry lines on her friend's face replaced with joy. The transformation was remarkable, not just in Mrs. Baker's expression, but in the entire atmosphere of the room. People who had once been strangers were now connected through this shared act of kindness. "Rose, dear," Mrs. Baker called softly, patting the space next to her. "Come sit with me for a moment." As Rose settled beside her friend, Mrs. Baker took her hand, her eyes glistening with tears. "I keep thinking about that first day you helped me through the diner door," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was so lonely then, so afraid of becoming invisible in my old age. But you saw me, really saw me." The diner's owner, who had been nearby, stepped forward. "Mrs. Baker, you should know that Rose worked double shifts for months to contribute to this project. She never wanted anyone to know, but I think it's important that you understand just how much you mean to her." Mrs. Baker's grip on Rose's hand tightened as tears spilled down her cheeks. "All those extra hours, that's why you looked so tired sometimes?" Rose smiled softly. "Every extra hour was worth it. You've given us so much more than you know. Your stories about teaching, your kindness to everyone you meet, the way you remember details about people's lives and ask about their families, you've taught us all what it means to be truly present in a community." The local minister, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward to share his thoughts. "What we've witnessed here is more than just a community helping one person. It's about how one person's genuine kindness can ripple out and transform an entire community. Mrs. Baker, your presence in our lives has made us better people." Throughout the afternoon, people continued to arrive, each bringing their own contributions to the celebration. The local music teacher had brought her guitar, and soon soft melodies filled the air as people shared their favorite songs. The children present had created handmade cards, their innocent messages of love bringing fresh tears to Mrs. Baker's eyes. As the day progressed, Rose's teenagers organized a system for recording video messages from everyone present. These would be saved on the tablet they had set up, allowing Mrs. Baker to revisit this special day whenever she wanted. The local tech store owner had, "Only now, you won't have to worry about those terrible stairs or that long walk. You can just enjoy your morning ritual with your diner family." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Baker's son helped her settle into her new bedroom. The space was perfectly arranged, with everything she might need within easy reach. Rose heard her friend's delighted exclamation as she discovered the framed photograph on her bedside table, a picture of her regular corner booth at the diner, surrounded by all the smiling faces that had become her second family. The story of the black waitress and the elderly woman had started with a simple act of kindness, holding open a door. It had grown into something much more significant, proving that love, compassion, and community could overcome any obstacle. As Rose took one last look at her friend, now safely settled in her new home, she knew that their story would continue to inspire others, reminding people that sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness could spark the most remarkable changes.